The prairie stretched wide and pale beneath a hard, winter-blue sky. Wind moved through the tall grass in restless waves, carrying the dry rasp of seed husks and the faint metallic tang of snow yet to fall. Far off, a lone rider approached, his horse's breath clouding in the chill. Leather creaked softly with each step, and the sound seemed to echo in the great emptiness. He had been riding since dawn, drawn toward the small cabin that now stood dark against the horizon. A cabin bought for $1, left behind by someone who could not bear the lonely winters. He had told himself it was a bargain, a start, a stake in the land. But as he came closer, a strange unease rippled under his calm, as if the house had been waiting for him. He dismounted in silence, boots crunching the crust of frost as he approached the cabin. The boards were weathered silver, door half-hung. Inside, the air smelled of dust and cold ashes, but there was another scent beneath it, something sharper, the faint sourness of fear. He stepped into the shadowed room, letting his eyes adjust. Then he saw it, a rope stretched taut from a rafter, swaying almost imperceptibly, and at the end of it, a girl. She was not fully gone. Her toes barely scraped the floorboards, legs trembling, nails clawing at the rope. For a moment, he could only hear the rush of blood in his ears. Then he crossed the room in 3 strides, cut her down with his knife, and caught her before she hit the floor. Her body was light in his arms, warm yet slack, breath shuddering. She made a sound, not a scream, not words, just a broken whimper, as if crying through water. He lowered her gently to the rug and worked the noose loose from her neck. Red marks ringed the pale skin, livid and cruel. She tried to curl into herself, but found his coat around her shoulders, ruffle wrapping her like a shield. He said nothing. Words were felt clumsy in the stillness, and she seemed to shrink from sound. Instead, he crossed to the hearth and coaxed life from the dead coals until a fire licked up, casting light over the bare room. She watched him from where she sat hunched, her breath thin, face streaked with tears. In the glow, he looked carved from the land itself, broad-shouldered, steady, his expression unreadable yet not unkind. When he brought her a tin cup of water, his hand brushed hers, and she flinched before she could stop herself. His hand stilled. Then he set the cup down within reach and moved back, giving her space. Outside, the wind rattled the walls. Inside, time thickened. She sat with the coat clutched tight, staring at the fire until her breathing slowed. She could feel him there, across the room, quiet as stone, not staring but not turning away either. There was no demand in his stillness, no push for her to speak. It was oddly comforting. She had not been given the dignity of silence in a long time. When her teeth began to chatter, he knelt by the hearth again and put another log on. The simple act, his care without question, made something inside her ache. She did not know why this stranger bothered. She had not expected anyone to come, had not planned to be found at all. And yet here he was, not asking who she was, not asking why, just staying. She kept her eyes on the fire and let her fingers loosen on the coat. The warmth began to seep in. The night closed around them. At some point, he placed a pot over the fire, and the scent of beans and coffee filled the cabin. Her stomach twisted painfully at the smell, but she did not refuse when he offered a bowl. She ate in small, mechanical bites, careful not to meet his gaze. He ate opposite her, slow and quiet. The fire popped once, startling her, and his glance flickered up, calm and watchful. She almost spoke then, some apology she could not quite form, but her throat tightened and she only shook her head. He nodded once, as if that was answer enough. When the food was gone, he stood and spread a spare blanket on the pallet by the wall. His movements were deliberate, neither hurried nor hesitant, and she understood the gesture for what it was, a wordless assurance that she could sleep, that she would not be touched. He set his hat on the table, then sat by the fire, pulling his coat tighter against the chill. The girl hesitated. She had not truly slept in days, fear gnawing her awake even when exhaustion dragged her down. But now the cabin felt different, still stark and lonely, but no longer hostile. She lay down on the pallet, pulling the blanket over her shoulders. The fire painted the ceiling gold and shadowed his face where he sat. She watched him until her eyelids grew heavy. Just before sleep took her, she thought she saw him glance her way. Checking to be sure she breathed. The thought settled into her like a stone at the bottom of a river, strangely grounding. For the first time in memory, she slept without dreaming. Dawn came gray and soft, creeping through the cracks in the boards. She woke to the sound of boots outside, the quiet scrape of it being stacked. He had been up before her, tending to chores. When he came back inside, he nodded to her but did not speak. His face was grave but not unkind. She sat up slowly, testing her own body. The bruises around her neck ached, but her breath came easier than yesterday. The coat was still around her shoulders, smelling faintly of smoke and horse. She pulled it tighter before rising. He brewed coffee and handed her a tin cup, which she took without fear this time. The warmth of it bled into her cold fingers. She studied him over the rim of the cup. He was not young, but not old, hair sun-bleached, jaw rough with stubble. Everything about him seemed shaped by work. Broad hands, quiet patience, a kind of gravity that did not demand attention yet held it. She realized he was waiting, not for thanks perhaps, but for her to decide what came next. Her voice, when it came, was a rasp. She asked him why he had come. He said simply that the cabin was his now. That answer landed between them with quiet weight. She looked around at the bare walls, the fire that still smoldered. The cabin had nearly been her grave, and now it was meant to be his home. Something inside her quailed at the thought of leaving, though she did not know why. The outside world waited beyond the door, wide and merciless. She sipped the coffee and said nothing more. He packed a saddlebag while she sat by the fire, unsure whether she was meant to stay. At the doorway, he paused and asked if she could manage alone for a few hours. She nodded before she could think better of it. He studied her a moment longer, as though weighing whether she meant it, then mounted his horse and rode toward the horizon. The sound of hoofbeats faded until only the wind remained. Alone again, she sat very still. The rope he had cut lay coiled in the corner like a shed skin. She crossed the room, knelt and picked it up. The fibers were rough under her fingers, still carrying the memory of her weight. She held it for a long moment, then fed it into the fire. The flames caught quickly, twisting the rope into blackened curls. Smoke rose and drifted up the chimney, leaving the air clearer. She sat back on her heels and let the warmth wash over her face. When the door creaked later that day, she looked up sharply, half fearing his return would feel like intrusion. But when he stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders, she felt something uncoil in her chest. He noticed the rope was gone, but did not comment. Instead, he set the supplies on the table and glanced toward the fire, as if to acknowledge the choice she had made. She turned her face to the flames, so he would not see the heat rising to her cheeks. Outside, the wind had shifted. The land smelled faintly of snow, and somewhere far off a coyote called. The sound no longer felt like a warning. The girl sat by the fire with the coat still around her shoulders, watching the rancher move through the small space like it already belonged to him. For the first time since she could remember, the thought of tomorrow did not feel unbearable. Something had begun here, something she could not yet name. The snow came 2 days later, soft as sifted flour, blanketing the prairie in silence. She stood at the window wrapped in the coat, watching the flakes drift past the glass. He had been outside since early morning, repairing a split in the fence, his figure bent against the wind. She was still surprised that he came back every day, that he did not leave her there to vanish into the wide country. His presence anchored the hours, gave shape to days that had once been an unbroken blur. When he came in, boots thudding, the cabin warm with the smell of snow and horse. He shook off his hat and glanced at her. The look was brief, but something passed between them, acknowledgment quiet as a nod. She had managed to keep the fire going in his absence, and the sight of it burning bright seemed to please him. He ladled stew from the pot into 2 bowls, wordless as always, and they ate side by side at the table. When she finished, she set the spoon down and found herself speaking without planning to. She told him her name. It felt strange to hear out loud, as though she had dragged it up from deep water. He nodded once, repeated the name softly, as if testing how it fit in the air. She watched him, waiting for the next question, but none came. The silence that followed was not heavy. She found herself grateful for it. After a while, she asked for his name in return. He gave it, and they sat together listening to the fire crackle, two strangers whose edges were slowly softening. The cabin began to change in small ways. He mended the loose door so it no longer groaned each time the wind pushed through. He brought in a small table from the barn, sanded and oiled until it gleamed. She found herself cleaning without thinking, sweeping out corners, folding blankets neatly. Work steadied her hands, kept her thoughts from spinning. One morning when he saddled the horse, she asked if she could ride with him to town. He studied her face, then nodded once. The ride was long and cold, but something about the steady rhythm of the horse beneath her and the line of his back in front of her made her feel strangely secure. The town came into view, a cluster of buildings huddled against the wind. The moment they dismounted, she felt eyes on her. The blacksmith paused mid-hammer. Two women outside the mercantile turned to stare, their conversation breaking off mid-word. A man at the saloon door tilted his hat back, gaze sliding over her as if she were something curious and half-wild. Heat prickled up her neck. She wanted to disappear back into the saddle, but the rancher's calm presence beside her held her steady. Inside the general store, the shopkeeper's wife looked from him to her, suspicion and interest flickering across her face. "Haven't seen you bring company before," the woman said lightly. The girl kept her gaze on the floor, waiting for him to answer, but he only said he needed flour, coffee, and nails. His voice was level, final, giving no room for gossip. Still, she felt the woman's eyes on her as they left. On the ride back, the girl's chest was tight with unease. She had not meant to attract notice. "They were staring," she said finally, her voice low against the wind. He glanced over his shoulder, then faced forward again. "Let them." The words were simple, but they settled into her like a stone, solid, unmoving. She held on tighter to the saddle horn and let the prairie open before her. As the days passed, she began to take part in the work without being asked. She chopped vegetables for supper, helped carry firewood inside, even brushed down the horse after a long ride. He did not thank her aloud, but the quiet satisfaction in his face was enough. Sometimes in the still moments, she caught him watching her with a kind of thoughtful patience, as if he were learning the shape of her silences. One afternoon, while repairing a crack in the wall, she felt a laugh escape her unexpectedly at the way the dust clung to her nose. The sound startled them both. She covered her mouth, but he only looked at her, the corner of his mouth tugging upward. It was the first time she had seen him smile. Something inside her loosened. For a long moment, they stood in the soft light of the cabin, dust motes turning like stars around them, and it felt as though the air itself was warmer. But peace never holds long. The day trouble arrived was clear and sharp, the sky a polished blue. She had gone to fetch water from the creek when she heard hooves, fast and hard. A man she did not know rode up to the cabin and dismounted, tying his horse with a rough jerk. She froze, her breath catching. His face was unfamiliar, but the way he looked at her was not. There was ownership in his gaze, a cruel twist of mouth that made her blood go cold. "Well," he said, voice too loud in the quiet air, "seems you've been busy hiding." She backed away, bucket forgotten, but he followed with lazy steps, as though enjoying her fear. Before he could get closer, the rancher's voice cut through the space like a drawn blade. He had appeared silently from behind the barn, one hand resting on the butt of his holstered gun, though he had not drawn it. "That's far enough," he said, tone flat. The man glanced at him, a smirk forming. Didn't know she had a new keeper. His eyes slid back to the girl, cold and calculating. "She's coming back with me." The rancher stepped closer, calm but unyielding, his body a wall between them. "She's not going anywhere." The other man's smirk faltered just enough to show his teeth. He spat in the dirt, then swung into the saddle. "This ain't over," he said, and rode off, dust rising behind him like a warning. Her knees gave way the moment the sound of hooves faded. He was at her side instantly, steadying her by the elbows. She pulled away, ashamed of her shaking. "I can't stay," she whispered, breath ragged. He crouched so they were level, his eyes steady on hers. "You can," he said simply. "You're safe here." The words sounded like a promise, and for reasons she could not explain, She wanted to believe him. That night, she lay awake listening to the wind scrape along the cabin walls. Every creak made her flinch, waiting for hooves, for fists on the door. But he stayed by the fire, calm, his presence a quiet sentry. At some point she rose and sat near him, drawing her blanket close. He did not look at her, only added another log to fire. The flames caught, bright and steady, and the light softened the harsh lines of his face. She found herself breathing easier. In the morning, she stepped outside before dawn. The air was bitter, but the stars were still out, sharp and white against the black sky. The memory of the man's sneer still twisted inside her, but there was something stronger now beneath it, a thin, fierce thread of defiance. She did not want to run anymore. When he came out to saddle the horse, she asked if they could ride into town again. He raised a brow but did not question her. The ride felt different this time. She sat straighter, her hands steady. In the town, the stares came again, but she lifted her chin and met them. Murmurs followed them into the store, but she walked at his side without faltering. On the way back, the wind carried the smell of thawing earth, and for a moment she felt almost light. She thought of the cabin waiting for them, the fire they would build, the work that needed doing. For the first time, it felt less like a place she was hiding and more like something that could belong to her. As the prairie opened ahead, she glanced at the man riding beside her. He was quiet as ever, his face turned toward the horizon. She did not reach for him, did not speak, but she let her hand brush the worn leather of the saddle, as though to steady herself for whatever might come. The road was still long, but she no longer felt she was walking it alone. The thaw came late that year, but when it did, it arrived all at once. Snowmelt running in rivers through grass, air sharp with the scent of damp earth. She stood outside the cabin at dawn, the sky streaked rose and gold, her breath pale in the cool air. It had been weeks since the man had ridden away with his threat, but the memory still lived under her skin like a splinter. She had thought time would blunt the edge of her fear, but it had not. If anything, the silence had sharpened it. Each day she waited for hoofbeats, for the past to crest the horizon, and yet she stayed. That staying had become its own quiet act of rebellion. Inside, he was sitting at the table, sharpening a blade with slow, careful strokes. His presence was solid, grounding, the rhythm of the steel against stone steady as a heartbeat. She watched him for a long moment before stepping inside. He glanced up, eyes catching the light, then went back to his work. It was not indifference, but trust that she could stand there without crumbling. She felt something in her settle at that thought. They rode into town that afternoon for salt, sugar, and word of the wider world. The town was restless with spring. Wagons clogging the main street, children splashing in puddles, dogs barking. She felt the familiar eyes on her, the sideways glances and whispers. This time she did not lower her gaze. She walked beside him into the store, chin high, and let the whispers roll past like wind. But the moment they stepped outside, she saw him. The man was there, leaning against a hitching post, hat pulled low, a grin that did not reach his eyes. Her stomach dropped, but she did not step back. "Well now," he drawled, straightening. "Didn't think you'd last out here." His gaze slid over her before landing on the rancher. "You keeping her tame?" The rancher's shoulders squared, but before he could speak, she did. Her voice came out steady though her knees trembled. "I'm not yours to take back." The words rang louder than she expected, turning heads on the street. The man's grin faltered. For the first time, she saw a surprise flicker across his face. He took a step toward her, but the rancher moved between them, his presence quiet but immovable. "Leave," the rancher said. The man spat in the dust, but there was an edge of uncertainty now. "This ain't the end," he muttered before mounting his horse and riding off. The town's hum returned slowly, but she could still feel the weight of eyes on her, a new kind of attention. She realized her hands were clenching to fists and forced them open. The rancher touched her elbow, a gesture so light she might have imagined it, and they walked back to the horses in silence. That night the wind rose, rattling the shutters. She sat by the fire long after he had banked it, staring into the coals. Fear and fury twisted together in her chest until she could hardly breathe. She thought of the man's face, of the way the town had watched, waiting to see whether she would shrink or stand. She had spoken, but it was not enough. Not yet. She could not live waiting for the sound of hoofbeats forever. The next day passed under a taut, electric sky, the wind carrying a storm's edge. He worked outside, hammering new boards into the fence line, while she cleaned the cabin with restless hands. Near sunset, as clouds rolled low and heavy, she heard the sound she had been waiting for. Hooves, fast and hard, heading straight toward them. She stepped outside just as a man rode into the yard, face dark with anger. "This ends now," he shouted, swinging down from the saddle. "You're coming with me." The rancher appeared from the side of the barn, hat low, shoulders squared. "She's not leaving," he said, voice calm but edged with steel. The man sneered. "You think you can keep me from what's mine?" He reached for her arm. This time she did not flinch back. She stepped toward him, heart hammering, and said in a voice that rang clear even over the wind, "I was never yours." The words stopped him cold. The rancher stood just behind her, close enough that she felt the heat of him at her back, but he let her speak. "You left me to die," she said, each word deliberate. "You don't get to come here and claim me now." The man's face twisted, rage breaking through surprise. He lunged forward, hand raised, but the rancher was faster. The movement was quick, efficient. He caught the man's wrist, twisted, and sent him sprawling into the mud. The man scrambled to his feet, cursing, but when he saw the gun leveled steady in the rancher's hand, he hesitated. "Ride out," the rancher said softly, "and don't come back." For a long moment, it seemed the man might try again. The wind howled through the yard, whipping hair into her face. Then, with a snarl, he mounted and spurred his horse, vanishing into the storm. Thunder rolled a moment later, as though the sky itself had drawn a line under what had just happened. She stood very still, rain beginning to pelt her hair and face. The rancher holstered the gun, watching the horizon until the last trace of the rider was gone. Then he turned to her. His face was grave, unreadable, but there was something softer under the stern lines, something almost like pride. Inside, they lit the fire again, hung wet coats to dry. She sat close enough to feel the heat on her skin, heart still thundering with the aftershocks of what had happened. The cabin felt different now, no longer a place of refuge, but a place that had been defended, claimed. She realized she had spoken not just to the man, but to the land itself, staking her right to stay. The rancher sat across from her, elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely. The silence stretched between them, but it no longer felt fragile. She looked at him and saw not just a man who had cut her down, but the one who had waited while she found the courage to stand. For a long time they only watched the fire. Then, almost without thinking, she reached out and set her hand over his. His hand was warm, calloused, steady. He did not move for a moment, then turned his palm to meet hers. No words passed between them. None needed. Outside, the storm broke, rain hammering the roof, washing the last of the snow from the earth. She imagined the tracks of the man's horse dissolving into mud, his shadow scoured clean from the prairie. The fire hissed as a log shifted, sparks rising like stars. Later, when the storm passed and the night grew still, she stepped outside. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, the sky so clear she felt she could see forever. The cabin behind her glowed softly with firelight. She thought of the rope she had burned weeks ago, of the girl who had been cut down and the woman who had stood her ground. The prairie stretched out around her, wide and wild, no longer a threat but a promise. She turned back toward the cabin, where he waited, and felt something settle in her chest, a quiet, steady knowing that she had chosen this place, this life. Inside, the fire had burned low. She crossed the room and sat beside him. He did not ask what she had seen out there, and she did not try to put it into words. Instead, she leaned her shoulder against his, letting the silence hold them both. The night was vast and full of stars, but for the first time, she did not feel small beneath it. She felt as though the land itself had shifted to make room for her. When the last ember faded, they sat together in the dark, and it was enough.